All right, I'd like to welcome everybody to MJ Cards and Games. This is our player spotlight for Joe Shaubach, one of our 40K players. How's it going, Joe?
Pretty good. Keeping sane in these interesting times.
Yeah, interesting is one way to put it. So as far as our player spotlight stuff goes, we just got a couple of questions for you. First off, is there anything that you'd like to share with us about your gaming background that we might not get into?
Hmm. Anything in my gaming background we might not get into? Uh, Nothing that really jumps to mind particularly. I know that's unexciting, but it is what it is.
All right. Well, so starting off with our first question here, how did you get started into gaming, and what drew you into it?
So, I've always had a history in military history. And for me, I really got my first taste of wargaming through historicals. My dad had a kit of German Panzer Grenadiers that he kept out in his workshop. I always thought those were cool and eventually got to build them. And I got Steel Panthers from a friend, and that's a computer based hex war game. The tabletop stuff, I just put two and two together. Wow, wouldn't it be cool if I could have these little models that I've just painted and put together fight other little models? And I was up visiting a friend of one of my uncles up at Gettysburg. Dude had this huge house. He was a living historian, just like my uncle. He financed their battery, so he paid for all of the horses. He was rich. And upstairs, he had this huge room with this giant table laid out, which I kid you not was about 6 by 20, laid out with I'd say 1/100th scale terrain with all his wargaming figurines on it. And man, I was so impressed. That really got me super keen on it and really interested. And eventually, some of my idiot friends in early high school were like, Joe, have you heard of a little game called Warhammer? It's a war game you can play with miniatures. And that turned out to be right up my alley. And it's just been one continuous spiral since then.
Awesome. So I know that 40K has been your biggest game, but I've also seen you do stuff like some of the more historical stuff, Bolt Action, Flames of War, Team Yankee. Um, in those, do you prefer competitive gaming? Do you prefer more a narrative experience, or is it kind of a mix for you?
It's kind of a mix. Like, the draw for all wargaming for me is to have fun, to well, to have fun in whatever form that takes. And sometimes you just want to throw down and beat your opponent and go, well, cool, that's me. I've won. I'm the better man. And other times you really want to have a little story. Be that, well, your tower trying to hold off my rampaging Chaos Space Marines, or the Cold War's gone hot and the West Germans have to turn their guns on the East Germans as they swarm across the border. It really depends. On the whole, though, I probably favor narrative more because it gives you a lot more flexibility for what you're going to do. You can bring stuff that is, strictly speaking, suboptimal and not really feel terribly bad about it because you're going for a story. You're going for the narrative as opposed to, well, if I take this unit, it's just going to get blown up.
That's definitely fair. That's kind of where I come from with a lot of my games too. Is I will take the units that look like they'd be fun on the field, or in terms of like a card game, cards that'd be fun in the deck, but not necessarily optimized.
Yeah, and I've I'll blame those idiot friends back in high school for wargaming being biased towards the narrative end for me too, because they made up rules all the time. They didn't have huge collections, so to keep things interesting, they'd do all kinds of silly gimmicks. I remember one game we put together where we ruled that, oh, if an Imperial Guardsman could successfully manage to like assault this Tau tank and wreck it, then we'd say that he jumped in and he took control of it for the rest of the game, which it's cool.
Yeah. Uh, with the myriad of tabletop systems that you play, do you have a favorite that pops out, or Is it
It's
different systems for different moods, something like that?
so my two favorites definitely have to be Warhammer, obvious answer there, and boat action. Warhammer's really cool for the fluff. 8th edition's crunch mechanically is pretty good, and the miniatures are fantastic too. And boat action I really like because of the mechanics behind it. Being able to have essentially random turn order. If you're not familiar with bolt action, every unit provides an order die, which you put into a bag and then draw one out, and then you can assign those dice out to your various units one at a time. So it's possible you can draw 3 units in a row that all take their activations, or your opponent draws 3 in a row where they all take their activations. And that element of randomness to it, that element of chance, really appeals to me.
Yeah, just a point of clarification on this for those listening not familiar with bolt action. Everybody's order dice go in the same bag, and you
Yes.
take orders drawing. So you could draw two of your dice in a row, or they could draw three of theirs, uh, and so that's the randomness aspect to it.
Yeah, and there's balance built into it too, which I like because if you're taking a 500 point tank in a 1,000 point list, you're going to have a really, really powerful unit. But at the same time, if your opponent brings 4 infantry squads, they'll have way more potential activations and way more chances to activate their key units before your tank even gets a chance to respond.
Yeah, the thing I especially like as both a Warhammer player and somebody who's looked pretty deeply at bolt action and its spin-off Conflict 47 is the fact that it's written by some of the same people that were responsible for early editions of Warhammer. You look in there and you'll see, I believe it's Alessio Cavator and Jervis Johnson are on there. I can't remember if Rick Priestley is as well, but it's definitely one of those. You read through that book and it reads like say the third edition 40k rulebook.
Yeah, it takes a lot of the lessons they learned from way back in the day working on 40K stuff. And I just looked it up. I actually have my copy of the rulebook right here. It's Alessio and Rick Priestley that did this up. They're
Oh, okay.
responsible for all of the rules.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, I don't know why I had Jervis Johnson in there somewhere, but
He's a cool dude.
oh yeah, yeah. All right. So our next question comes back to something that you mentioned in your background. You've been known to apply historical themes to your gameplay. Some of it narrative, some of it competitive. I remember you using, I think it was Bane Blades, and you were treating them as Age of Sail, Ship of the Line. Going with that approach at an event. How has that worked out well for you? Has that worked out decently, or is it just something you kind of do for fun and see what happens?
Definitely for fun and to see what happens. Competitively, like the Triple Baneblade list was a gatekeeper list. If, for those of you not familiar, a gatekeeper list is it's one that's going to shut down people that haven't played against it before or who aren't prepared for it, but is pretty easy to beat if you know the correct way to approach it and you've built your list to have a little more flexibility with it. It's fun, but it had really big weaknesses. On the other hand, narratively, using historical concepts for list building or applying historical concepts and goofiness like that, a lot more fun because you can talk with your opponent ahead of time and specifically set up fun scenarios around it. Like, hey, why don't you set up a trench network and I'll send all of my super heavy tanks to go and break through it? And narratively, too, not just with the lists, being able to draw on some of the actual reasons why a battle might occur can make a game a lot more interesting. Instead of, oh, hey, we're fighting over a lost relic yet again, it can easily be, hey, so our troops are going to arrive from reserve in waves because our patrols have blundered into each other and they're calling in reinforcements from all over the place. And that's a lot more interesting than, yeah, let's fight over the relic one more time.
Yeah. So another part of your gaming resume is that you have run quite a few events. You've run a lot of local events, especially for us and for some other stores. And I know that you've done some essentially state level events before. Which are there any that stand out as being your favorite type, or do you have any good gaming memories attached to any of those?
So for some people familiar with it, this is going to sound a bit controversial, but I actually have really good memories of the early Alaska Battle Brothers. Those events had a really good turnout, really fantastic tables. They had a lot of problems going. They were growing events for me. Terrain, we went with narrative terrain, not great for competitive play. There were admin issues, there was associated drama, but it was one of the first times I really got to see so much of the community in one place, including guys coming down from Fairbanks and meeting up with them for one of the first times. And it was a similar experience for a lot of the community. That's where we started seeing some of our earliest familiar faces that we know in the greater Warhammer community as well. And more recently, I really enjoy all of the Charity Hammer events I do because I really get a kick out of trying to play the whole carnival barker slash con man deal. For the Charity Hammer events, for those of you at home, the way it works is Rob handles the whole charity aspect. He selects a good cause the store will support. I put on an event, and then players through donations, be it cash or whatever the associated charity needs, they make these donations, and I let them get extra special abilities during the game. And it's just so much fun to me to go up to a guy and go, yeah, I'd say that model doesn't have cover. He's easier to hit. If you donated $5 for a good cause, or for $20, man, I'd say he gets to stand back up and fight a second time. The 700-point model your opponent finally killed. Let's give it a shot. It's all in good fun, and no one takes it super seriously, which is even better.
Yeah, it's definitely that and our summer cookout are definitely my favorite 40K events of the year. Well, I mean the local ones. I got a lot of love for like Battlezone Ursa and stuff like that. But
Oh, of course,
as
of
far as
course.
like local events go, those two are definitely my highlights as well. All right, so getting back to some 40K specific stuff, if you could change one thing in the rules in 8th edition, what would it be and why?
Man, and this one's given me a lot of thought. And ultimately, I'd have to say the cover rules. The cover rules right now are both too simplistic and too complex in that cover is just a static +1 to your save. Really cool, really awesome, mechanically useful. But it's too complex because, well, and let me combine these two again. It's too simple because you don't have a whole bunch of types of terrain. It's too complex because out of these types of terrain, half of them don't really do much for certain units, only for other units, and have extra effects tacked on. There's both too little like diversity of types of terrain, but too much mechanical diversity at the same time. It'd be a lot better if they could have like three big broad types, and then you were allowed to group literally everything on the board into those. And they all gave slightly different mechanical bonuses or functions slightly different mechanically. I like cover a lot. It's important.
Yeah. All right. Winding down our list here. Give me your favorite gaming memory.
Okay, and this one I had to really think about because I I have a couple of them. Because one thing I really love about any game, any war game specifically, is that ultimately there's a huge element of chance in it. And I always enjoy a game where things start spiraling out of either player's control because of the invisible hand of fate. Because those are always the most interesting situations when things aren't going to plan and suddenly you have to change gears to exploit an advantage or to shore up some sort of disaster that's happening. So one that comes to mind for that is I was playing my friend John R. He's really cool, and he was playing his let's see, Space Wolves as Raven Guard for the first time. They were all clustered up around a tank, and I was trying out the new Alpha Legion stratagems, I should say, plural. And I popped the tank, and I spend my command points on one of the new stratagems, and mechanically, it makes it way more likely for the vehicle to explode, and if it explodes, your opponent can't reroll a die to try getting out of the explosion. So I blow up the tank, I use the stratagem, of course it blows up, and he proceeds to roll some of the most horrendous rolls for damage for every unit around. Because when a vehicle cooks off, it does damage to every unit nearby. I ended up killing probably a quarter of his army in that explosion. Just hunks of metal scything all over the place. Killed his warlord, took out another character, blew apart two different squads. Just absolute carnage. Fantastic. But my other big one recently, here at Grim Resolve, we just had that tournament up here, and 5 games in one day. Really intense stuff. Really a test of your endurance as much as you're playing. I played against the O'Donnells, and both of my games against them were absolutely fantastic because they are both playing demons, and I'm playing Grey Knights. And mechanically, we both get huge bonuses against each other. I kill them faster, and they have an ability to bring back a whole unit back onto the board. So these games became extremely involved messes where we're both leveraging our abilities to the fullest, where we're both trying to pull out all the stops and get that little advantage for the final points to close out the game. And I won both of those games, but it was only by a margin of, I believe, 3 points and then 1 point. They were so close. And the whole time, it just felt like I wasn't sure I could actually win. It's great when you have that combination of background. Grey Knights are supposed to fight demons. Demons come in them in these huge waves, and it combines to make a really great play experience against fantastic opponents too. Everything just lined up on those games, in other words.
Yeah, it's really nice when you have that nice combo there to where you're having a good time with your opponents and you're having a good game. I mean, for me, the best games have always been the ones that have been decided at the last second. You don't know how it's going to end up, and it's just that narrow margin for either party because you know you're happy for yourself, but you're also like happy for your opponent because it's like, oh, it was just this close. It could have gone either way. For me especially, those super close games are the best ones.
Yes, indeed. A blowout isn't particularly fun either way, but when it comes down to the wire, so entertaining.
Yeah, definitely is. Alrighty, Joe. So that was about the end of our question list here. Was there anything you wanted to talk about?
Not that immediately comes to mind. If I'm one of your first interviews, hit me back up in a couple weeks when I have a better idea of how everyone else does this, and I'll put them all to shame.
Alrighty, sounds good. Thank you very much. And this is MJ Cards and Games Player Spotlight signing off.